how could we design enough real estate in orbit that average everyday people can begin to participate in the future of human spaceflight? That's why we talk about an inclusive future. We want people to realize they don't have to spend their entire career as a NASA astronaut, as honorable of a profession as that is, to be able to be a scientist that does their own research in space, or film a Hollywood movie in space, or do industrial biomanufacturing in space. That era is coming really quickly. We're at an incredible inflection point for participation in this new era of low Earth orbit spaceflight.
Welcome to the Shaping Science podcast, where we talk with experts from science, academia, industry, and beyond to explore the latest in research, education, and innovation for the public good. I'm Nick Dirks. I'm the president and CEO of the New York Academy, and I'm today extremely delighted to be able to welcome Dr. Ariel Ekblaw for an engaging discussion at the intersection of physics, artificial intelligence, space exploration, philosophy, and ethics. Dr. Ariel Ekblaw is the founder and CEO of Aurelia Institute and GP for Aurelia Foundry Fund, where she strives to bring humanity's space exploration future to life. She previously led the MIT Space Exploration Initiative at the MIT Media Lab, where she completed her PhD and graduated with a BS in physics, mathematics, and philosophy from Yale University. So, Ariel, wonderful to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining our podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I'd like to begin with just basically asking you to say a little bit about how you went from being interested in physics and philosophy to low orbit space. Tell us a little bit about your journey.
Well, my parents are both Air Force pilots. So my dad was an A-10 fighter pilot, and my mom was one of the first females to fly for the U.S. Air Force, period. And so I was really steeped in aviation and exploration and science fiction as a kid. And then I got to Yale, was doing physics and philosophy. I love big picture questions about the universe, and I thought I was going to go to physics graduate school. And then I had an opportunity to fly as part of NASA's Reduced Gravity Student Flight Opportunities Program, very tortured acronym, one of the coolest things I have ever done. And NASA used to support students to bring their own experiment that the student would get to design on a NASA parabolic flight. So a Vomit Comet, those planes that simulate microgravity, simulate the environment like what astronauts experience. And after that, I was completely hooked. I have since flown in zero-G 14 times. And that was really the transition point for me in my schooling, where I decided what I wanted to work on was the future of human spaceflight.
So on the one hand, space is an endless frontier, or at least the new frontier. But on the other hand, space is a hugely constrained place in which to think either about, travel, given all the constraints, or doing science. So, starting with that, that kind of moment of incredible excitement about being in flight and experiencing zero gravity. And I take it you haven't actually been in space yet.
Not yet. Not yet. Yet being the operable word.
Will be. So you could have decided at that point you wanted to become an astronaut, which perhaps you did, but, via this particular route. But clearly you began thinking about, a project that would involve doing science in a different kind of way and taking advantage of the opportunities that space affords without compromising things that you might do because of obviously the incredible range of constraints. So could you talk a little bit about your development as a space scientist, given that those two words are still kind of unevenly sitting adjacent to each other?
Yes, absolutely. So this is the beauty and the gift of having been able to go to MIT for graduate school in a very particular program. So my training as a scientist and an engineer came from a combination of the MIT Media Lab, which is very entrepreneurial. really focuses on prototyping, demoing products, hands-on learning, rapid prototyping. And MIT Aeroastro, a really storied department, had a role in the Apollo 11 moon landing, incredible depth of rigor in the curriculum of that education, more traditional science and engineering education. And I was co-advised between the two departments. So Dr. David Newman, who was the former deputy administrator of NASA, was one of my advisors. And then I was really lucky to have a group of advisors at the Media Lab. What that allowed me to do is an interdisciplinary PhD, which I also think in the age of AI is so important to be exposing students who are wanting to become scientists to an interdisciplinary awareness of fields. That's really where so much innovation is happening, is at the intersection of different scientific fields. And so my background melded physics from undergrad, where ironically I had focused on particle physics, so not immediately the most relevant for space, but big scales, tiny scales. There's some interesting, communing between those two.
Yeah, well, there's some particles that go pretty fast
Exactly.
in places
Yes,
underground.
places
and
underground,
big,
exactly.
empty holes.
Yes.
But
And really a curiosity about the standard model of physics. There's so much of that we can probe through aerospace and even human spaceflight, being able to man or crew these experiments on the International Space Station like AMS that are helping us learn more about fundamental physics and particle physics. But so my academic training was this mix of, I'd say traditional physics education and then aerospace structures. How do you actually assemble something in orbit bigger than your biggest rocket payload fairing? And then the final piece of this is the Media Lab, which is under the School of Architecture and Planning at MIT, for which I had this incredible opportunity to work with Neri Oxman, an incredible source of inspiration around architecture and design. And so my PhD tried to knit this together and say, how could we self-assemble using principles from nature and biomimicry, self-assemble and snap together what we now call a tesserae space habitat, something using essentially space Legos that have really powerful magnets and dock together autonomously. And then that forms a shell that can become a habitat. What's going to make that habitat a life worth living in space? That's the architecture and design, and bringing that into the future of human spaceflight.
So you begin with the constraint of the fuselage size.
And size,
right?
Exactly.
And you had to figure out how to build a bigger structure.
Yes, than that size of that rocket payload fairing. Exactly.
Yeah, so that was, that's kind of, puzzle number one. But puzzle number two is what size structure both can you build, and also what do you need for the kinds of things you're doing? So how did you begin to develop your kind of sense of both possibility and scale?
So this question that you're asking about the constraints and the affordances, that's exactly what's so exciting about space. We have these constraints, size, mass, and then we have this unique affordance of microgravity. What can you do differently in a free fall environment, a floating environment, than how you would do it on Earth? And so I began to think about self-assembly is a mechanism that works really well at small scales in biology. There's a certain beauty to that because, again, at these really macro scales up in space, with microgravity, you can have some of these same dynamics, almost like Brownian motion and random walks to bring pieces together. We also think about the constraints of the vacuum. So the materiality, what can we build the structure out of? We love using rubber here on Earth to fill gaps and make things airtight. Can't do that in space. Rubber outgasses, becomes really brittle. So you have to look at other types.
O-ring.
Yes, famous O-rings. Yes, infamous O-rings. So we need to think about other materials like a non-outgassing silicone, for example, that might provide the gasketing around the edges of the tesserae tiles so that when they all come together with the magnets, we clamp them in, and that gasketing makes sure that they're airtight in between.
So what does airtight mean when there's no air?
So on the inside, yes, very good question. On the inside of the habitat, we are going to insert air. So we're going to pressurize that habitat so there'd be air for you and I to breathe.
That's if it's occupied by a human.
And that's if it's occupied, exactly. And we need to contain the force due to air pressure that's trying to push and explode the habitat outwards. We need to contain that force with clamps. And so that's why the gasketing material, for example, is so important. I say you and I, and that's not cheeky. Really, the goal of our work at Aurelia Institute, which is my nonprofit that we've now spun out of my lab at MIT, is to say, how could we design enough real estate in orbit that average everyday people can begin to participate in the future of human spaceflight? That's why we talk about an inclusive future. We want people to realize they don't have to spend their entire career as a NASA astronaut, as honorable of a profession as that is, to be able to be a scientist that does their own research in space, or film a Hollywood movie in space, or do industrial biomanufacturing in space. That era is coming really quickly. We're at an incredible inflection point for participation in this new era of low Earth orbit spaceflight.
So I want to ask you more about the possibilities for different kinds of activities in low orbit space, but let me begin with the science question, because you've obviously thought about some different applications that could either allow the manufacture or the experimentation of science-related projects. So if you could give us a few examples, both, that would be, I think, really, really interesting.
Absolutely. One of our mission points is to say, what is the purpose of life in space? We think growing space infrastructure for the public good needs to do something that can immediately serve a need of human citizens on Earth, not just thinking about space tourism and farther out scale exploration. One of the most compelling scientific applications that we can run in an orbital lab, like the Tesserae self-assembling lab, is biotech manufacturing. I'll give you two examples. The first is artificial retinas, pioneered by an incredible company called Lambda Vision, Nicole Wagner's company. They take 200 layers of a bacteria dopsin protein and do this really stable but kind of gingerly put together cell matrix or a protein matrix. And it's difficult to do that on the ground. On the ground, we have sedimentation due to gravity. So even small defects that are caused by a little bit of sagging on the ground would affect the quality of that artificial retina matrix. It turns out in zero-G, that matrix grows in an incredibly pure, consistent fashion. So companies like Lambda Vision would be able to manufacture artificial retinas in orbit, stabilize them, and bring them back down to Earth. And the promise of that is curing macular degeneration. So curing that loss of sight as we age. They're also targeting retinitis pigmentosa. And what's really blocking us now is we need them to be able to scale up that science. So they've done, I think it's 8 or 9 missions to the International Space Station, incredibly well de-risked, but they need to move from manufacturing, tens of these artifacts to hundreds of thousands of these retinas. And that's one of the things we're most excited about, our Tesserae volume, this real estate that we're trying to scale in orbit, being able to enable something like that. The other example I'll give you on the science side is organoids. Organoids are tissue models that mimic some of the tissue behavior of an actual organ in your body, and they are proving more and more important for testing cancer drugs and Alzheimer's drugs, also, across a range of other disease models. It turns out, thanks to amazing NASA research that's been done on the International Space Station for the last 10 years, certain types of organoids, the tissue matures faster in zero-G. So in some sense, they grow better, or at least they have an accelerated pattern of aging. Mm-hmm. That is incredibly valuable for age-related diseases or replication-related diseases like cancer. So what we're looking to do now is have an orbital biolab facility where you can scale up the production of organoids, again, bring them back down and do that work here on the surface of the Earth. So do the actual final biomedical or biotechnology work here.
So these are both, extraordinary illustrations of the utility of zero gravity space for all kinds of both manufacture and experiment. And of course, that's a zero-G environment. But if you put people up in space and who are going to need air and so on and so forth, you're going to have different kinds of compartments in the larger Tesserae structure.
Absolutely. One of the long-term goals that we need to solve for the physiology of humans in orbit is we need to spin the habitat. We need to be able to get artificial gravity, and that's because it turns out our bodies don't do so well after about 6 months.
Well, that's what we've been learning, right?
Yes,
from extended residence on the space station.
Astronauts like Scott Kelly, we come back, we learn about his bones, his heart, the shape of his eyeballs, all of these different things that change, even affecting the telomerases in your DNA and your chromosomes. So the long-term solution, we think, is to have a ring-like habitat where in the center you can still have a microgravity environment because that's not rotating. Why go all the way to space to take away the benefit of microgravity? That's the special thing you want to access. But for the humans living and working in that research station, they need to be able to live or at least spend a lot of time on the outside of the ring where you get that centripetal force. And depending on the diameter of the ring and how quickly you spin it, you can get more or less gravity. So you can try to approach maybe 0.8 of Earth's gravity, for example. And if we do this well, we have a speculative concept, farther advanced in the, pushing out the timeline than our tesserae work, which is really near term. That biolab, we think we can do in 5 years, within the next 5 years. Artificial gravity, we have this concept of a Nautilus space station that has multiple rings that looks like a seashell. The reason you might want to have multiple rings, spin them at different rates and get different gravities. So have a ring that tests out Martian gravity, have a ring that tests out lunar gravity, and then also something closer to Earth gravity for the health of the bones and the hearts of the astronaut.
I see. So there'll be more than two compartments
Yes.
As this gets designed.
Yeah.
So tell me some of your thinking about other things that humans might do usefully in space. You mentioned making movies. Clearly, there are lots of other things going on in low orbit space, and I'd like to know a little bit more about both, the range of things that's being done, but also what you do around both the traffic that you start getting and also the waste that is generated. But let's just start with, the range of things that you could potentially do beyond the two kinds of examples you just provided.
Yeah. This is one of the things I love talking about the most because I want people to stop thinking of space as a sector that may or may not be relevant to their business and start thinking of it as a domain where all of these different activities will be relevant. So, we've already hit on biotechnology in orbit, novel types of science, and really that extends to material science, things that just behave differently in that fundamentally different environment. There's entertainment, right? So Hollywood's already thinking about filming the next Mission Impossible movie in space. There's hospitality.
The stunts would be
The
easier.
stunts would be epic. Yes, the stunts would be a little easier. There's hospitality. People are already thinking about space hotels. Hilton has famously done a DoubleTree cookie collaboration with the International Space Station, baked a DoubleTree cookie in orbit. And of course, from 2001 Space Odyssey, these ideas about, big expansive life in space. I think there will be other opportunities, certainly around space situational awareness. We have an opportunity because we see so many growth areas in this emerging space economy. In addition to the work at the nonprofit, we just started a VC fund where we invest in space companies because there's such a burgeoning level of activity. What really makes all of this feasible is in the last 15 years, the cost to get to space has dropped dramatically. So from about $50,000 a kilogram under the NASA shuttle era to with Starship coming online, it's anticipated to be around $200 or less per kilogram, which is like FedEx.
From here
to orbit or from here to the moon even. But right now, at least those prices are from here to low Earth orbit. That's remarkable. If you can ship something around the Earth, you can ship it to space. Maybe not the humans just yet. We're a little more fragile, but certainly at a cargo level, that type of pricing is enabling my lab's work to send a large tesserae space Legos up to space. It's enabling an entire range of activity. And what I usually try to say to people is kind of a closing argument on this topic of what can we do in space? Why is it so relevant? We go to space for 3 reasons, not just one. The first is tactical. So these are things like Kevlar, transistors, microwaves, things that came out of the development of the Apollo program, for example. There's a long tradition of designing for the rigors of life in space, or even just operating in space, that teaches us how to design for extreme environments and produces incredible technology for the benefit of life here on Earth. So that's the tactical. The strategic, the second category, is we learn a lot about Earth when we go out and we explore elsewhere. So we learned about greenhouse gas emissions from Venus, from sending early probes to Venus. We kind of have an understanding of where our planet might be headed if we're not thoughtful about anthropogenic climate change. But we also have this beautiful quote from Bill Anders, who was the Apollo 8 astronaut who orbited the moon. Christmas Eve, 1968, takes this iconic photograph of the Earth rising above the horizon of the moon, known as Earthrise. And he famously remarked, "We came all this way to explore the moon, and in the end, the most important thing is we discovered the Earth." And that photo helps to launch the environmental movement in the United States. So that's strategic. That's really an example of space expanding our concentric circles of awareness as a species. And then the final, for me, is philosophical. What does it mean to be human, especially in the face of an AI future? I think one of the few really special, unique things about our species is we value knowledge for the sake of new knowledge, and we want to explore. And so I think space exploration can continue to give us an amazing purpose as a species, even as so much of the opportunities and burdens of our day-to-day lives become something that we integrate AI in. I think space exploration stays something that's really powerful for humans uniquely to do.
So you mentioned AI, and you mentioned before Space Odyssey 2001. So, of course, everybody is going to think about that green button named HAL, and the fact that, of course, in that wonderful Kubrick movie, we get the specter of what AI could do. And, of course, now that we have people who are predicting all kinds of possible outcomes with the development of large language models that are, exploding in terms of their capabilities, we begin to actually see that there was the actual possibility that something like that could happen. But of course, in space, one is going to be presumably extremely reliant on AI for everything from basic operations to doubtless even keeping these different multiple compartments properly, everything. So there are a number of questions I want to ask you about governance, but I want to begin with the AI question. Because, of course, AI, too, raises those philosophical questions about what is quintessentially human, what and how do we think about the human as it changes, as we change in relationship to a technology that is so rapidly itself transforming, and how do we hold on to something, particularly now that AI can do the thing that we used to think was most human-like, generating coherent language. So I just, how are you thinking about AI as both an operational side of this, but also as a philosophical kind of index for how we manage to advance our technology while not compromising our humanity?
It's a huge question and a really important one. In the context of space, we have kind of a positive and a negative example. We have HAL from 2001 Space Odyssey takes over, loss of human agency. And then in Star Trek, we have the famously loved computer that they talk to that enables their missions, that is this wealth of incredible stored knowledge, almost something that you can build a relationship with in the holodeck. I think it depends on how the next, I was going to say decade, but honestly, it's probably the next year or 2 years of AI safety research, which path we go down to be able to not necessarily even guardrails, but shape with certain principles the development of AI and its interfacing with humans. What values are being encoded into those LLMs that are ultimately then driving so many interesting new collaborations and companies and foundational architecture for a lot of new technology that's coming up. And I think that there's wonderful, thoughtful work going on in Silicon Valley and elsewhere in London and around the world to make sure that we're not failing to think about encoding it with certain principles. But then there's always a question of when does it become agentic itself? And can we control something that is itself super intelligent or has its own agency or has its own ability to rewrite its code, gather its own resources? And that gets more into the realm of really big questions about how would we continue to have a human civilization balanced with that level of capacity with super intelligence. Different camps out there, MIT camp, Silicon Valley camp, think it's at different rates or different number of years before we might hit an inflection point where we have to face that kind of a future. For now, I think the most responsible thing that we can do is within each individual subfield, and I'll give you an example of what we're doing for space, think about the ways it can go wrong a lot of technologists, we are optimists. Even if we're not utopians, we're still optimists. We're building something because we believe there's a world worth building for. We ought to also take a moment and pause and think, how could this go really wrong? And can we design a fault tree analysis, which we love in the space industry, to think about protecting the right uses of AI? So an example in space habitats, absolutely. We want space habitats to have that shell of the architecture itself be natively embedded with IoT, future smart devices, and AI being able to be responsive across the entire infrastructure of the physical built habitat to the future occupants. But that means that those habitats of the future are incredibly more wired and online than they've ever been before. That exposes us to a risk of hacking and cybersecurity. So in the design of our habitats, we're already thinking about how to counteract those threats and making sure that we're trying to have as expansive a notion of that technology spec as possible when we sit down to think about the future of AI integration with our work.
So that is the potential positive, or at least that's the kind of mitigation that you're thinking about. But you also mentioned that there is as many negative possibilities out there as there may be. There are real positive ones. You've given the kind of early example of how space allows one to see the Earth as a single integrated entity that we all inhabit and share together without borders, boundaries, and divisions. Certainly, if you're far enough away, but you think about this philosophically as well as technologically, and how would you imagine one might be able to learn from some of the things we do in space, lessons that could be really of use beyond that one that you mentioned, of course, the launching of the environmental movement, which is huge, but other kinds of examples of things going forward that might be refracted from space onto our planet, where we desperately need some help right now.
Yeah. One of the biggest topics that I've been really passionate about since my time at MIT is this notion of it's a bit of a tongue twister, we need to rebrand it, but the anthropocosmos. So we've just learned, as a civilization, as a society, about the Anthropocene, this era where humanity's presence has come to be really dominant on the Earth, for better and for worse. I still think primarily for the better, but we see the impact that we're having with climate change, and we need to be thoughtful, responsible about doing the right mitigations as we move forward. We have an opportunity at the cusp of the anthropocosmos, as our civilizations, thinking about going off into the near neighborhood of the solar system, to take just a moment to pause and say, okay, what have we learned about the Anthropocene? What are our responsibilities and opportunities as stewards of the space commons? And space really is a profound commons. So if we can learn through governance, democratic models, international stakeholder models, how to do governance of the space commons well, maybe we will create a tool set that will allow us to come back and respect and do Earth commons stewardship in a positive manner as well. Of course, we have our own problems in the space industry we have to solve, like space debris, already really crowding up certain swaths of low Earth orbit. But now I think a lot of attention in the space industry is trained on that problem. And I think we will be able to both keep it from getting worse. There's rule sets from the FAA about forcing everything that gets launched up to have an explicit responsible deorbit plan as of 2018 or 2019. And then also mitigation. How do we clean up all of the trash and the debris that's been left? That's a test case for us as humanity. Can we meet this first challenge of the tragedy of the space commons, learn from it, and then re-architect our approach to life in space?
Yeah, no, we didn't do so good a job the first time, so hopefully we'll do better the second. But before I ask you kind of a question about the governance, how you govern space, let's talk a little bit, not so much about what goes wrong with AI, but what is, and not just the question of debris, but low orbit space is obviously being used. It's being heavily used, and it's being used both for telecommunication purposes, but also for a different kind of strategic purpose, namely military, geopolitical kinds of objectives on the part both of the United States and China, for sure, but other nations too. So could you give me a kind of landscape analysis of low orbit space in terms of how it really is being used right now, and what perhaps are the challenges and issues that come from that use as we head towards thinking about better governance models that we might be able to deploy?
So right now, I would say most of the money that's made in the space industry, most of the activity in low Earth orbit is GPS, telecom, Earth observation. So being able to have satellites in orbit that are looking down, either spy satellites or commercial satellites. An amazing example is Planet Labs. We learn so much about the change in the Amazon, or the hydrology and the change of water patterns on Earth from this Earth observation ability. That's on the, it's a lot of that is commercial, some of that is defense. There is a whole nother bucket of activity right now on the DoD side within low Earth orbit. And I do think it produced an immune system response and a backlash in some parts of our communities. But Space Force is actually really important, and there's a historical precedent for the Air Force spinning out of the Army around the end of World War II, as also the rise of commercial aviation went up.
Mm-hmm.
We are at an inflection moment where we have to be thoughtful about defending democratic interests in the governance of human spaceflight. And we do have adversaries that would take a very different governance approach to space if the opportunity arose. And you can think about it as simply as we want to defend shipping lanes. We want to keep them open. We want our allies and people all around the world to be able to have a free and accessible use of space. And to be able to defend that, you do sometimes need the high ground. And so that's why I think there is a very responsible, ethical, important role for Space Force to play in this next era of preserving and protecting operational opportunities and capabilities in space. And we also can't ignore the fact that we are in somewhat of a Cold War with China, and there is a space race and an arms race growing. So, as much as people do absolutely, and we should preserve the peaceful uses of outer space, we need to at least be thinking about our posture with respect to adversaries. And that's why you see a lot of talk right now in military defense and government spheres around space as this next domain where they're really focused.
And there even are stories about, various kinds of entities in space that are dissembling what and who they are, and doing surveillance and effectively engaging in espionage and military activities of one kind or another, and not hostile actions yet. But
as has happened in aviation now for decades, essentially that same posturing and that same competition and that same patterning is also going to expand up into the space domain, I think.
So, of course, when some of the things happened around, the use of air for both commercial travel and obviously military purposes in the aftermath of World War II, that was the period of international cooperation. There was a Cold War, but there was also the birth of the United Nations,
right,
and all
Bretton
kinds
Woods
of
agreements and all these things.
kinds of international agreements. We're at a very different moment right now. There seems to be a kind of reaction to retrenchment from rethinking about global collaboration. And of course, that makes it, I think, all the more challenging to think about, even as space on the one hand seems, pardon me for saying this, but a long way away. On the one hand, on the other hand, more and more trafficked, and extremely relevant for every kind of next generation technology, and like frontiers of old, exploration, use, conquest, colonization, and things that are not necessarily going to be good either for space or for Earth. So how are you thinking about the kinds of challenges of governance at the present moment?
One aspect that we take onto our own responsibility with the Aurelia Institute, we do R&D, we do education and outreach, and we do policy. So I think we are trying to model, as a thought leader, responsible behavior in that we assess our own technology for its potential to cause potential future problems, and we try to design around that. So an example for us with these test array self-assembling tiles is, would those contribute to space debris? Well, if they're not properly managed, it's possible. So let's make sure that we're designing in that proper technological approach. This is an example of a model that we hope other people can also take within their space organizations, which is to say, do that policy work to think ahead about the potential negative outcomes and do your responsible active mitigation first. At a bigger scale in society, about, talking about global multilateral stakeholder collaboration, are we seeing the death of that? Or, where is the space industry headed without that kind of leadership? In the first Trump administration, under Jim Bridenstine, who's very widely respected on kind of bipartisan, both sides, NASA administrator, they put out the Artemis Accords, which was an approach, an attempt to say for this next era of cislunar exploration, which involves passing through low Earth orbit. So it also kind of bears on a little bit of what we do closer to home, but certainly for the moon and interacting on the moon, how are we thinking about international collaboration? And that document, I think, is an interesting first step towards trying to bring people, at least our allies, to the table to have an open dialogue and a discussion, much in the way that the International Space Station was an impressive international feat of collaboration. We know that we need that kind of collaboration to be able to successfully expand humanity's horizons, even just to do a short-term settlement on the moon, much less a long-term settlement. So there are, even in this era, where people are, Trump administration talking about pulling out of NATO or Paris Climate Accords, there are other ways that we can get creative about still doing international collaboration for space. Besides the Artemis Accords, another technique, to give credit to one of my colleagues, Eli Sandler at Harvard, has this idea around a space COP. So much like the environmental focused climate COPs, the Conference of the Parties, we need to add a COP mechanism to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty that would allow us to go back and tweak the treaty without having all the signatories have to re-sign off on everything every time within their nation states, and begin to build a body of international guidance on how to, basically, norms of behavior for operating in space. And so I would say, although it might look like a dire situation from the outside, there is a lot of shared momentum within the space industry around trying to figure out governance. We know we need it because even companies that don't want to be over-regulated, they need some guardrails to be put in place so that they can get confidence to give to their investors. If I go to the moon and I mine helium-3, I know I have the right to sell it on Earth. I've checked all the boxes. Even those type of companies want to be able to have some certainty around international regulation, or domestic regulation at least.
So this raises the question about, not just the uses of space for, for science on the one side or for military or geopolitical purposes on the other, but, for industrial purposes, that is to say, for building companies and doing all kinds of things. Not that the science doesn't lead to companies. Science will lead to many companies, I'm sure. But give us a little bit of a sense of what the space industry is. And I have to ask you about SpaceX and the role it's played, not just in lowering the price of sending things into space, but also more broadly, opening up a whole area of industrial possibility.
Absolutely. So I'll start with SpaceX, and let's talk a little bit more broadly about the industry as well. SpaceX isn't a major way our road to space. There are other incredible partners out there. There are new companies like Stoke Space that are coming up. There are traditional, actors like ULA or Blue Origin now finally getting New Glenn going, who are going to contribute to that ecosystem of being the road to space. SpaceX really pioneered it in an incredibly reliable and reusable fashion with their rockets. And so that has empowered this wave of other space businesses to be able to begin to service low Earth orbit. So to give you an example, if you think about ocean freight on Earth, there are these big carrier ships that will get you across the oceans. Once you get to a harbor, there will be a tug, somebody that takes you a more, shorter distance within that final mile that you might have to go. In space, we have the rockets. We don't yet have the space tugs. Someone is going to make a bunch of money doing what we now call orbital transit vehicles. There are several really interesting space startups who are coming out to basically say, once you get to your rough orbit, if you want to move around a little bit, we can help you deliver to your next final location. That's an example of the ecosystem that's starting to emerge around low Earth orbit, at least. Now, the reason that there's a justification for that ecosystem is Earth-based satellites. A lot of people want insight from space on things that are changing on Earth. Insurance companies want it for rising coastlines. Farmers want it for agriculture. Businesses like Walmart want it to know how many cars are in their parking lot. Then there's kind of the rise of human spaceflight. So the International Space Station is being decommissioned in 2030, 2031. There are now kind of a flowering of groups of companies that are doing commercial space stations to fill that gap. And just yesterday or 2 days ago, Voyager Space IPO'd. So Voyager Space is one of the new wave space station companies. I'm pretty sure that they are a CLD company, or at least they're part of this ecosystem of companies that are commercial LEO destinations, working to win a big contract from NASA to be the inheritors of the ISS. And it's amazing to see that Voyager just had a very successful IPO run by Matt Kuta and Dylan Taylor, who we're lucky to have as advisors for our VC fund. And that's an example of just how much activity there is in the space industry. It now makes sense to have a commercial, not military, not defense or government, commercial space station in orbit.
So one could imagine that there would be space stations for all kinds of purposes: industrial, tourism, science, the arts, and things perhaps that even you haven't thought about yet. But at this point, in terms of the kind of technological infrastructure that you would need to actually get the lowest possible cost attached to completely reusable rockets and and self-assembling structures that would go beyond the even the already impressive contours of Tesserae. What do you see as the next kind of set of big challenges and moments when one is going to break into a new era?
My mind always jumps to human spaceflight and what we need to really be able to democratize access to space, get more humans up there, and fundamentally push out the boundaries of humanity's horizons. How far can we travel? Right now, even if the cost to get to space dropped dramatically tomorrow, even more dramatically than it's already dropping, we only have room for about 14 humans in orbit, period. So the breakthrough that I'm really excited about is essentially scaling up the real estate in orbit. The bottleneck isn't rockets anymore, it's real estate. To be able to do that and do it ethically, if we want to allow some of that real estate, space stations or spaceships, to take humans further out, we need to figure out radiation. So as soon as we leave the protection of the Van Allen belts and Earth's magnetosphere, which is what keeps our atmosphere intact, protects us from solar bombardment, as soon as we leave that general area, we are exposing humans to much more significant
So
radiation.
low Earth
orbit is still inside the Van Allen belt.
Is inside that belt. Okay. So how big is that belt where one is above any kind of gravitational field, but still within the?
That's a good question. So there's we talk about LEO, low Earth orbit, MEO, and GEO. So GEO is farther out above the Van Allen belts, if I recall. Yes, LEO, MEO, and GEO. I have to check myself on that, but I'm pretty sure GEO is above the Van Allen belts.
MEO is just right.
Yeah, MEO is just right. Yeah, exactly. So within LEO, you're inside of the protection for radiation, and you're still in a gravitational field per se. You're just in free fall around the planet. So you're not able to easily escape unless you rocket yourself out. But you're absolutely right. You're in free fall. So you're not feeling gravity because you've gotten up high enough in orbit to be in free fall. You've crossed the boundary of space, which we call the von Karman line. And the Blue Origin New Shepard craft that famously took Katy Perry and the other crew up recently, they go just barely up into space. They cross the von Karman line and come back down. The ISS is, as you were saying, far enough to be, removed enough that you can free fall around the planet. But if we're going to be able to have humans living in space longer term, we have to spin the habitat, so that breakthrough will be important. That's more engineering than science. We know how to do it, we just need to build it. But there's fundamental science needed in protecting tender, gentle human biology from radiation. And so thinking at things like water walls, Radiation from space can be protected in some regard by having a shell of water around the outside of your habitat, a great NASA concept. There's also some work at MIT looking at, I think it's carbon boron nanotubes and other ways to essentially refract or protect against radiation coming into the habitat. So that's something I'm really interested in thinking about for the future of habitats.
So we're coming close to the end of our time, but in the last couple of minutes, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your fund, because you're not only developing Tesserae and exploring all kinds of partnerships and ways in which you could use this for, in the first instance, these amazing kinds of scientific possibilities, but you're also out there looking to raise money for, and invest in other kinds of ventures. So I'd love to give you the opportunity to tell us a little bit more about the full range of things that you're doing.
Thank you. So when I spun Aurelia Institute out of my lab at MIT, it's been about 4 years now, 3.5 years. And the original idea was to get the nonprofit going. So it was a good incubation environment, and then we would add the VC fund onto that. The reason I wanted to do space investing is I looked out in the space industry and I said, this is an incredible domain. We're at this incredible inflection point where a lot of money can be made, a lot of good can be done, but there are holes. There's pockets where we need new innovation. And I think as someone who's really deeply steeped in the industry and brings a lot of technical expertise, I can be helpful filling and plugging some of those gaps by empowering companies to come up to flesh out the ecosystem of the space economy. So that is really my mission and my purpose in having the VC fund. We are really fortunate to have been able to already get started. So we interim closed on 30 million. We've done just over 10 deals now in a range of 4 different categories. So we do a lot of space satellites. That's the kind of near-term path to exit for the space industry. We're looking at in-orbit material science, biotech, like what we talked about, Nicole Wagner's company, Lambda Vision. Climate and space adjacent technologies. This is really amazing space platforms that would benefit life on Earth, a big addressable Earth-based market. And then we'll also do space for space companies. This is where we think we'd find the next SpaceX. So maybe a space habitat company like Max Space, inflatables, or something that is going to power the entire next era of the growing space economy.
Well, Ariel, I feel like we've only, as it were, scratched the surface both of space, but also of the extraordinary work you're doing.
Thank you.
So I hope we'll be able to bring you back and have you join us again for another episode of Shaping Science. But thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, everyone listening, for this episode of Shaping Science. We hope you'll join us for future episodes soon. To learn more about the New York Academy of Sciences, including information on upcoming events, visit us online at nyas.org and follow us at NIAS Sciences. Shaping Science is made possible with the generous support of Tata Sons.